Hello and welcome to Property Roundup on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon. Today I'm delighted to be joining you from Galway Docks, and I'm joined by a very familiar face, but perhaps one that's telling us an unfamiliar message. I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran Mullooly, MEP. Kieran, thank you so much for joining me today in Galway. People will be so familiar with you, you're a household name, but the MEP at the end is new. Tell us a little bit about the journey you've been on.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you today. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, your viewers and listeners, will know me from 25, 30 years of television with RTE on Ear to the Ground, originally on TV news and radio in the Midlands and elsewhere. But throughout that period, what people do not know is that I've been deeply involved in community development, rural development. As a volunteer initially, I worked in Roscommon, Longford, Midlands general area. And then after I left RTE, I went back to work for one of the leader companies. And I got myself engaged for the first time in issues such as social housing, social inclusion, and that broad area. So I suppose I whetted my appetite on community development needs, you know, looking at our towns in the Midlands and the west of Ireland, seeing the changing face of them, seeing the major issues there for the people, and the serious problems with infrastructure, particularly in the housing area. And that's why I put my name down for politics. Independent Ireland approached me, Michael Fitzmaurice, the TD, asked me if I'd put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, and the rest is history. I'm just glad to have been appointed Vice-Chair of the European Parliament Housing Committee, and you know, I'm here in Galway and I'm looking forward to learning more about the needs of this area so that I can go back and helpfully hope to compose some new ideas and maybe some new legislation down the line for housing.
Well, and that's exactly why I wanted to speak to you today, because I've been in this industry for a quarter of a century and I can tell you it has been a tough few years in terms of finding reasons to be hopeful, and one of the things that I was very hopeful about was when the EU appointed an EU Commissioner with responsibility for housing and energy, Dan Jorgensen. So you might just explain a little, because it's not well known enough in Ireland, the fact that now there is an EU Commissioner for Housing and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, initially there would have been a position that Ireland, each member state was responsible for housing. It was a competency of the home state. But Ursula von der Leyen made it clear at the end of her first term that housing was coming up at every meeting, every parliament session. Housing and the lack of housing is as big an issue in most of Europe as it is in Ireland. We may feel we have the crisis under hand, but I can tell you they have a crisis in Portugal, they have a crisis in Spain, they have a crisis in France, they have a crisis in Holland, all across the EU. So she decided she would bring in a commissioner for the first time. Now, it's not the first time, however, that the European Commission have funded housing. You know, the European Commission is involved greatly in the social inclusion area. So a lot of the houses you see in your communities, if they were built by Respond Housing or perhaps even down to the Simon community, that type of housing was built with social inclusion funding from the European Union. And so she sees this as an extension of it. She's brought in Dan Jorgensen to take the brief, and he meets us next week in Brussels for the first time. And we're going to look at the nitty-gritty, I suppose, of what's on the agenda. Firstly, an affordable housing scheme. Von der Leyen says she wants one. Now she's postponed her own scheme until the Housing Committee can produce it. So we are the guinea pigs now. We're going to have to produce our own process for that. And she's also hoping that the whole issue of land and property can be dealt with as well. So I'm looking forward to rolling up the sleeves. I've already going around the country meeting communities. We met in Navan and County Meath, had a super meeting with the community that day. I was stunned by some of the issues that were at stake. I think I said to you already, I met some people from St. Vincent de Paul who were there that day and spoke about the fact that they are funding the rent for a couple I would describe as being in the squeezed middle in Ireland. They're both working, they've got children, and they're paying an exorbitant rent in that part of Navan. And as a result, their rent is paid by St. Vincent de Paul. I was astonished by that story. But you know, these sections are intended to hear about the developer side as well. You heard that day. We heard about the big issues coming back to me. I'm sure we'll discuss them in this interview. You know, the problem with the rent pressure zones, the downside of them, and the departure of so many small builders from the building sector. So I'm learning slowly. I never claimed to be an expert on housing, but I'm certainly learning and listening as we go around the country.
You know, I'm so glad that you said listening, because actually what we don't need is another expert. What we do need is some sort of listening mechanism to the community, and to understand that community goes across the people who are living within the communities that are developed, but also those developing. But to bring in academia as well, because we are sitting now on so much data. and yet it doesn't seem to be feeding directly into policy making. So there's a disconnect somewhere, and this is where I personally am very hopefully not naively excited and optimistic about this new approach. So in terms of the Housing Committee now within the European Commission, you've taken one of the Vice-Chair roles.
That's right.
What does that mean? What will that mean in terms of what work will be undertaken over the next 12 months?
It means for the first time we're going to have a pretty significant Irish influence at the top table. Irene Tinagli is the chair, a very experienced economist from Italy, who will chair. I've spoken to Irene already about this, and we are sitting down to focus on some of the key issues. For instance, she asked me to immediately list 4 or 5 of the key areas that I felt would make a significant difference or should be looked at. Remember, part of our committee is to do this research you talk about, to do it properly. But I've come back to her, and I'm glad to reveal to you for the first time my agenda, at least in the initial stages of this committee. I've identified 4 areas we're going to go after and look at very, very carefully. One of them is an issue which was dealt with before in Irish life and was controversial at the time, but perhaps not be quite so controversial this time. That's what I would describe as a minor programme of decentralisation around the country. I'm proposing, and I'll be looking at it in depth, that in Europe and throughout Europe, that we look at the opportunity of taking the pressure off our major cities, trying to get away from Dublin's sprawling housing, from Lisbon's problems, from Madrid's, all of these problems, and trying to bring our housing development to regions where it is possible. And to use joined up thinking as well. Take a city like Galway, to look in Galway and to do some analysis, proper research, and see if we can do this successfully. Take some of the government departments out of we've done it already, there are government departments in Galway, but take some more out. And perhaps, for example, examine the feasibility of taking a brand new department out of Dublin and building the housing for its staff and for their families on land owned by the state here in Galway. For instance, what would be wrong with building new housing on the perimeter of the Merlin Park HSE complex? Significant amount of land there, huge portions of land, and trackings of land in that area. And I'm not saying it can be done, I'm saying we should look at it for the first time. And similarly, my colleagues throughout Europe are saying, let's take the pressure off our major cities. So that's one of my first priorities.
There's something of an irony, though, in looking towards decentralisation at a time when so much of our planning function has been lost to centralisation.
That's right, and that's another area we're looking at, and I'm glad to say that I think there's going to be changes there as well. We have asked in certain zones in regional development if it is possible that we can expedite the planning process in the first instance. It's come up initially in the just transition zone, which is a different topic in a different area, but it doesn't mean that it's not a good principle. The suggestion is if you need fast answers to a problem, you need a fast planning process. You need a good appeal process. You need to be sharp and quickly. The Just Transition Commissioner, Ciaran Mullooly, said to me, I could do nothing in Ireland because I couldn't plan anything within a 5-year spell. We want to see housing planned and constructed within a 5-year spell, not just going to plan. So I'm suggesting that's a key area to look at. There's another one which you would say, and as a rural MEP based in a really rural part of County Roscommon, I would be keen on, and that's the area of one-off housing. I have to say it's time to revisit this. Local authorities all over the country have a strict policy on this. I think at this point in time, with the advances that have been made with regard to technology and environmental programs in particular, and environmental facilities for new housing schemes, one-off housing, we have to go back and revisit this situation whereby a family member is not allowed to build on the parents' land. This has to change. We have a crisis in housing. We have to move quickly to provide sites. If the land is available to the family and the environmental arrangements are put in place so that it's a clean, efficient system that's in place for wastewater, etc., then I think it's time we went back on that rule in Galway and every place else, and legislation will be required in some cases to make the change that we have one-off housing and it's allowed for direct family relatives.
Kieran, I'm so happy to hear you say that, and I know our audience will be too, because actually you talk about our policy for one-off housing, but I would suggest that we don't have a policy for one-off rural housing. We have exemptions to policies for one-off rural housing, which is actually it's playing into the notion of decline of rural areas. But of course areas are going to decline if you starve them of social capital. And I just wonder, in terms of the conversation around environmental sustainability, do we need to give equal weighting to the conversation around social sustainability? Since COVID, we're in a different place.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think COVID showed that in emergency situations we can adjust, and we have to adjust. And that's what I'm saying about housing. I really feel, none of the measures I've mentioned today are going to solve the problem overnight. I wouldn't be, naive enough to suggest that they would. But if you take the family network situation and the availability of land, and you say we haven't got enough land for housing in Ireland, then it goes without even a debate that we avail of the land which is available for social purposes, social housing, social inclusion. What would be wrong with building houses for social inclusion in a land owned by the state in this city and all the other cities around the country? So we need to be brave. We need to have a little bit of imagination on this. We need strong government, and I'm hoping that we will see the government come forward, because they've had a bad year in terms of meeting targets. And I hope that they will learn from their problems there, listen to the sector, and let's build more social housing than ever before. That's what I think we should be doing.
That falls into the second pillar that the Housing Commission is going to be looking at, and the Housing Committee there. So you've touched on the European Affordable Housing Plan, but also a European strategy for housing construction. Specifically, what will be the agenda there?
Well, I think what von der Leyen is and Dan Jorgensen will look at initially is the Austrian model. This has been thrown around a few times in the past. It's nothing new, but in other countries in Europe it's very successful. As you well know, in Austria, as high as 15% of the housing is actually constructed by the state. This is provided.
Is this cost rental?
Cost rental. So built by the state. This is the critical factor in it. If we're looking at the construction sector, there's a focus here at the moment on investors. And how are we going to ensure investors get a return on it? That model that von der Leyen has mentioned, and she's in favour of it, and she's asked us to look at it in depth, was that if the state can be equipped to construct houses, then why not do it? Now, it's not going to happen overnight. Similarly, we know the apprentices situation. We know small builders are going out of the business around here. But she's suggesting to us that this Irish dream that our mother and father always planted, own your own home, get on the ladder, get on the first ring of the ladder, that perhaps sometimes it doesn't make economic sense. Sometimes, if particularly in small families starting out, that it may be better to have a rental situation and evolve over time. I'm open to suggestions on this. I'm looking at it very, very carefully. What I've seen in the Austrian model, there are plenty of signs that it works. I have concerns about whether we have the know-how and the wherewithal to do it as a state to start building houses again. But we did it in the past. We did build council housing in the past.
We built council housing in the past, and we allowed people to buy out those council homes, stay within their communities, strengthen the communities. It created generational wealth for the first time that enabled perhaps families to start sending people to third level education that had never done it before. So actually, I would suggest that isn't a system that didn't work. The element that didn't work is that we didn't keep building and providing. And I worry that if the state moves towards social housing for life, then actually that's a lot of housing that the state has to then retrofit in 30 years' time and take care of and maintain.
There's an element of that, but as I said at the outset, it's not going to, one measure or two measures are not going to solve this problem. We're going to have 10 or 15 measures. I believe when this settles down initially, the solution will be 15 or 20 different ways of building houses, 15 or 20 different ways of getting in, but we're still going to need investors. We're still going to need the sector. I mean, what I heard in Navan was very scary that day about the number of the people, the small builders particularly, who got out, who couldn't compete in the market, who couldn't buy land, couldn't get involved. We've got to deal with that situation. We've got to bring more and more land back into play. I've great sympathy for people who talk about the absence of recreational facilities around the country. But if we haven't got land for houses, we're in big trouble. We need to sharpen the state's role in this. If this means compulsory purchase, then I think we should look at compulsory purchase. We haven't tended to do that in the past, but the option is there. And if we have a crisis and people are sleeping in hotels, to St. Vincent de Paul is paying their rent in rented homes, we need to act.
If people want to contact you, they can certainly go onto your website, contact you. But I want to reverse this a little and say, right, you're new-ish to politics. How can the community help you by actually letting you know what the problems are, so we're not working off old assumptions? How can they help you understand that?
There's no problem doing that. I'm fortunate, I suppose, to have been involved in community development all my life. It's in my roots. I was chairs of community voluntary committees, and I was chair of a housing committee in my time in Longford, supported the work. And I think that's probably the key to it. Firstly, by contacting me directly at the European Parliament in terms of. Secondly, we're going around the country. We're coming to Galway. We're in Kildare next, I think, and Laois. I'm focusing on this hotspots in my constituency for starters. I'd love to meet people there and then. In terms of playing a role, I think we need to see more social housing groups. We need to see more. Every town is different. So I think in many respects, if you take a town like, say, a town like Galway, perhaps an area like Renmore, which has an existing strong army base there and defence base there, they have a very different requirement to what housing would be in Clifton. Would be a different type of. So I think the more housing development groups we have coming together, the better. I know for a fact that the chair of the housing committee is strongly in favour of supporting more social housing. I am strongly in favour of it. One of the key things I'm going to try and work on with her in the future is one of her recommendations is that instead of the old system in Europe whereby funding for housing schemes and other major factors is retrospective, I'm trying to enhance and encourage the Commission to take some trust in the people building the houses. Many of these people have been building houses for 30 and 40 years in the social sector, and therefore to provide advance funding, upfront funding of up to 70%, 75%, and that helps to get the project started earlier, get the work started earlier. All the hard work that's going on in the bank, trying to get mortgage, bridging loan facilities in a housing group. Most of our groups spend most of the time doing this, trying to find the funding. If we could get the funding up front, I think it would be key to doubling the number of startups in social housing in a year. You still retain an element of the funding, the last 15, 20%. Yeah. But you give the people who are the experts, who have experience in it and have good governance. That's critical. If they come in with good governance, they're not fly-by-nights, they've built thousands of houses around the country, give them the money up front. It's there, it's available, and let's get on building the houses.
Kieran, that's such a practical approach, exactly what we need to see, and I'm conscious that you have a busy agenda ahead of you in Galway, so we'll wrap up. But finally, just because I want to align expectations, because it has been a very frustrating few months for people who are on housing lists, for people who have, by the way, developers who have developed homes and are not able to put people in because of delays with social housing funding drawdowns. Yeah. And it's frustrating for the industry who are working there, as well as the communities that are I suppose, an upheaval around that. So to align expectations, it is the first year of this EU Housing Committee. What can we realistically expect over the next 12 months?
I think you're going to see, firstly, fairly significant research done to identify the different parts of Europe and the different problems. As I said, Ireland has unique problems that other parts of Europe. I think there'll be a period of research at the very beginning. The European Parliament Research Agency has a very fine reputation. I'll be asking them to come to Ireland to gather good quality intelligence from the building sector, from the social sector. I think as we head into the serious end of business at the end of the year, September, October, you're going to see hearings. You're going to see some of the principal movers and shakers in banking, in planning, in finance, and all across Europe coming into us and explaining why the money isn't there, why the average couple trying to borrow 200,000 euros having a problem with the bank, which is a major factor. That's going to happen later in the year. And one other area you're going to see coming down the line, I think this year, I hope it'll be a recommendation from our committee to the Parliament and to the Commission to move on it immediately. And that's an area very close to my attention, very close to my focus. That's housing for people with disability. We have a fairly shocking situation in this country where up to 60,000 people who should be living at home alone are living in nursing homes because we have not empowered the local authorities and the community to build houses which are properly facilitated for people with disability. I think that's something that can be done much quicker. I think we can move on that in terms of housing regulations much quicker. I'd like to see that in the agenda for the first 12 months as well.
Very good. We look forward to seeing that. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I hope you find the next few days in Galway understanding the landscape here. I hope you find it interesting. I hope you get to ask lots of questions as opposed to feeling like you have to provide the answers, because I always think the community have so much more to add. Yes. So it's really a platform to listen to the community. So I think that's a very valuable one. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and we're delighted to support any work that you're doing with the Housing Committee, and congratulations on your appointment as Vice Chair.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, and hopefully we'll have an update 12 months time to see what progress we have made.
you probably will be looking for that update in 6 months, because the urgency at the moment means that actually I think we're going to be keeping a much closer eye, because actually there are high hopes.
Yes.
There are high hopes pinned on this, and hopefully it will unlock maybe some of the stalemates across some of the interdepartmental challenges that have arisen.
Let's get down to do it.
Let's do it. Great attitude. My thanks to Ciaran Mullooly, MEP, and my thanks as always to producer Carol Tallon with Hear Me Roar Media on sound. And finally, thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next Property Roundup here on iProperty Radio.